This incestuous family took the lives of over 1,000 people.
Within this tattered teddy bear is not stuffing, but a living, breathing human, a prisoner of a heinous charade.
Starting us off at number 10, Moko Makai. Long before the interference of European colonists, the Maori people of New Zealand showcased status through a practice called tamoka, which are facial tattoos. These tattoos not only marked a rite of passage, but also signified rank, lineage, and occupation, and were a highly respected and sacred practice. Now, when someone with Moko passed away, either naturally or through battle, they would sever the head from the fallen body and preserve it by boiling it, smoking it, drying it out, and finally dipping it in shark oil. If the person had been killed by a warring tribe, it was kept as a trophy. However, in other cases, families would keep the heads of their fallen loved ones, treasuring them and only bringing them out for sacred ceremonies. Now, the reason I say all of this is because at first glance, you kind of assume that this guy sitting in front of all these mummified heads was the one to have been responsible, but that's not the case. This man here, Major General Horatio Gordon Robley, served with the British Army during the 1860s and was but one of the soldiers to pillage and steal the heads right out from under Maori people. Disgustingly, he then tried to sell the stolen artifacts back to the New Zealand government. However, they ended up being displayed at the American Museum of Natural History instead.
Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have The Fire. This is a photo that comes to us from 2003 at the Station nightclub in Rhode Island, and it shows the band Great White as they perform. While this seems like just a regular photo that someone took on their Motorola Razr, what ensued shortly after this photo was taken is absolutely tragic. Basically, as the band performed, there were some pyrotechnics that were set off, and while this was meant to be a spectacular display, it only ended up in disaster. The fireworks ended up setting all of the flammable acoustic foam in the walls and ceiling on fire, and within 1 minute, everything that was combustible was up in flames. Within 2 minutes, the entire club was fully engulfed in black smoke, and people were having trouble finding exits. In the end, this fire took the lives of 100 people, and another 230 were injured as a result. It has gone down in US history as one of the worst and most deadly nightclub fires. In our number 9 spot today, we have The Core. This photo shows a physicist named Harold New, and while this looks like a relatively normal, non-threatening photo, what he has in his hand is truly devastating. Harold is holding the nuclear core of what was nicknamed the Fat Man atomic bomb. This means that Harold is holding the nuclear core of the atomic bomb that was later dropped on Nagasaki in 1945. The immediate blast, of course, took many lives, but so did the long-term effects of the bomb, like radiation illnesses and that sort of thing. It's crazy to look at a photo like this because it seems so perfectly normal when he literally has a life-changing, world-ending device in the palm of his hand. Also, I don't think I could ever hold something like that. Not only would I just not want to, but I don't think I could even get near it for fear of something going wrong. In our number 8 spot today, we have The Eruption. This is a photo that is showing Mount Pinatubo, which is located in the Philippines on June 15th, 1991. That is the day that this volcano erupted into what would be the second largest volcanic eruption of the 20th century. Certainly impressive, also extremely terrifying. This photo shows the pyroclastic flow full of hot gas and rock being flung into the air. Eruptive activity in the volcano first started on April 2nd of that year, which prompted researchers to set up seismographs in the area. By June, the volcano was having a group of progressively shallower eruptions before, on June 12th, the volcano had its first spectacular eruption, which sent an ash column 19 kilometers up into the atmosphere. Additional smaller explosions continued on June 13th, which then led to some intense seismic activity. After more highly gas-charged magma reached the surface, on June 15th, the volcano once again exploded, this time sending the cloud of ash 40 kilometers up into the atmosphere. Volcanic ash and pumice blanketed the surrounding areas, and pyroclastic flows filled what were once deep valleys with fresh volcanic deposits. It is truly magnificent and extremely powerful, and this photo shows just that. In our number 7 spot today, we have Post-War. This is a photo that is said to have been taken in 1946, just after the end of the Second World War. Story goes that the person in this photo is a soldier who had just returned home from war, which would already be difficult and challenging enough, but as he returned home, he came to hear the news that unfortunately, despite his survival, his family had lost their lives during the war. There is no doubt about the impact that either world war had on the world, and how the impact doesn't stop once the war is over. These wars changed the course of history, and they changed people's lives forever. This is definitely a difficult photo to look at, and it's an eerie reminder of those dark times. In our number 6 spot today, we have the disguise. Speaking of the Second World War, as it began to come to a close, many of the Germans who were involved in all of the many violations of human rights began to flee or try and hide or disguise themselves for fear of being persecuted. One of those was, of course, the worst of them all, Hitler himself. This photo, or rather series of photos, was created by the US government as an attempt to document the many ways that he could have disguised himself in order to escape being recognized and captured. At the time, the fear of him being able to escape responsibility and go on living his life abroad was very real. I mean, there have been others who actually did manage to do just that, and that is exactly the reason for these photos. There's also something kind of interesting and bizarre about what happens when we take away the features of his that we know him by. In the end, he didn't escape and go on to live abroad, but he did escape being held responsible before the world.
Next up at number 9, dentures. Well, today dentures are made from composite resin or sometimes porcelain. During the 18th and 19th centuries, of course, those materials weren't available. But as you can imagine, people were still losing teeth at an even higher rate due to the high sugar diet, attempted teeth whitening, which was really just wearing away their enamel instead of brightening it, and the overall lack of knowledge around hygiene. So dentures were still needed and wanted by many. So what was their material of choice? Well, for the easiest and most profitable route, many would acquire the teeth from dead bodies. Although if you had some money, you might be able to afford dentures made from ivory. Other materials were sometimes the teeth of animals or wood, but honestly, I think we can all agree that none of those sound like terribly sanitary options, considering professional physicians at the time weren't sterilizing instruments, and some didn't even believe in disinfecting prior to surgery. Next up at number 8, stained glass. If you walk into just about any old church, you'll notice the walls are decorated with beautiful stained glass. But what might surprise you is that in some of the particularly older pieces, there is a strange ingredient that helps it all come together. In 1112, a German monk wrote about the process of creating the beautifully colored glass, and as he detailed, it starts off, innocently enough, adding sand and potash at a high temp until it becomes molten. From there, they'd add a stabilizer before coloring the glass with different metallic oxides like copper, cobalt, and gold. But once the glass was cooled and shaped, the small details were added by paint. They made the paint usually from lead or copper and would then suspend it in urine. So quite literally, some of those old stained glass windows were painted with pea paint, which I mean kind of just makes me giggle if I'm honest, but it is definitely a weird ingredient to think about being in paint. Coming in at number 7, leather-bound books. Nowadays, it's unusual to even find real leather on anything, but once upon a time, the leather on books wasn't even from cows. It was from people. Called anthropodermic bibliopegi, the books were made in a similar way as they would now, but obviously with one huge difference. They used human skin instead of an animal. While there are actually only 18 confirmed books of its kind that still exist, we have no idea just how many there could have been all those years ago. Allegedly, the books were usually made from executed convicts, and during the French Revolution, there were rumors that a tannery for human skin was established outside of Paris. I mean, it kind of gives me the willies to think about it, and I'm just glad we've moved on to a different material to bind our books today.
In our number 5 spot today, we have the Titanic. We all know the story of the Titanic. I mean, it's one of the most famous in history, and this photo comes from just before the historic iceberg encounter. On April 10th, 1912, the Titanic set sail on its maiden voyage, heading from Southampton over to New York City. The ship took a couple of stops along the way, one in France, one in Ireland, before setting off for the United States officially, and somewhere along the beginning part of its journey, someone was able to snap a photo of the ship as it sailed. It's not clear exactly where this photo was taken, but it is thought to be the last photo taken of the ship before its tragic end. Considering it was only 4 days after the ship set sail that it hit the iceberg, it is likely that this photo came not too long before the terrible day. In our number 2 spot today, we have the first day. This is a photo that shows Dorothy Count Scoggins as she joined her new school. What should be a perfectly normal activity was certainly anything but for Dorothy, as she was the first black person to attend Harding High School in Charlotte, North Carolina, which was previously an all-white school. After the passing of the Purcell Plan in 1956, there were 40 students who applied for transfers, and Dorothy was one of 4 who was accepted. This photo clearly shows that although small steps were being taken within the law to prevent segregation, there were no steps being taken within the students. As Dorothy just tries to get an education, you can see her peers clearly trying to disturb her peace. After 4 days of this kind of treatment, Dorothy's parents ended up withdrawing her from the school over fears for her safety. These images, however, were seen around the world. This photo acts as quite the reminder for where we were really not all that long ago.
Next up at number 8, radium girls. After its discovery in 1898, radium quickly became one of the hottest things on the market. By 1914, the United States Radium Corporation began developing a special glow-in-the-dark paint using radium, which was mainly used for watches they would send off to soldiers during the war. However, the corruption began after they started hiring young female workers to use said paint to make these radium dials, but despite having an understanding of the harm it could inflict, they did nothing to warn these women, nor did they provide them physical protection from the substance. In fact, they actually assured them that the paint was harmless, and more so, instructed the women to make a point out of the brushes with their lips to keep the fine tip for the watches. So the women in each facility began unknowingly ingesting copious amounts of radium, and the process became known as lip dip paint. And some of the girls even began to paint their fingernails, face, and teeth with the stuff, as once again, they had been told it was completely harmless. However, as we know now, that was far from the case, and tragically, many of these radium girls, as they were later coined, either died from the exposure or at the very least suffered extensive poisoning. Tragically, little did the women in this photo know they were already dying a slow and painful death. Coming in at number 7, Mary Reeser. On the morning of July 2nd, 1951, in St. Petersburg, Florida, Mary Reeser's landlady went up to the old woman's apartment to deliver a telegram. But upon her arrival, noticed something strange, that her door was warm to the touch. Still, she opened it nervously, and to her horror, she found Mary almost completely reduced to a pile of ashes on her chair, with only a small part of her left leg and her shockingly shrunken skull remaining. But what exactly happened to Mary? Well, that's kind of the million-dollar question. Local authorities were unable to determine the cause of the fire, as the rest of the apartment was relatively unscathed. And when the FBI became involved, they determined Mary had essentially gone up in flames like the wick of a candle, while her own body fat fed the flame. But still, the question of how the fire started in the first place remained unanswered. Often referred to as the Cinder Lady, there was a theory at the time that Mary suffered spontaneous human combustion, but whatever it was that happened certainly left a terrifying crime scene.
We're going to start off the list with this image here. This is not one of those niche taxidermy pieces. This is indeed a living two-headed dog, pieced together by a mad scientist. Vladimir Demikov was a scientist from the Soviet Union who did some really questionable stuff back in the 50s. He came up with this strange idea of attaching the head of one dog onto another, creating a two-headed dog. Now why? Well, he wanted to figure out more about organ transplants and see how the body would react to these surgeries. From a pure scientific perspective, what he did was kind of a big deal. It was about pushing the limits of what doctors could do back then. But is it incredibly creepy and unethical? Absolutely. This sparked a huge ethical debate. Seemed like some bizarre freak show rather than an ethical scientific pursuit, and people got pretty upset about it. Playing around with life like that, creating these weird creatures just for the sake of curiosity, it didn't sit well with a lot of folks, and unsurprisingly, the dogs didn't live very long after these experiments. So while Demikov's work was kind of groundbreaking, it was also just downright cruel. You know what's downright cruel to us is if you don't subscribe to this channel. I mean, what are you waiting for? It's free. We got awesome videos coming your way on the daily, so don't miss out. hit that button down below. Next up, we have this image here of Captain Robert Falcon Scott and his team of explorers after finally reaching the South Pole. It had been a long, grueling, treacherous expedition, and they'd arrived only to find out that a Norwegian team of explorers had beaten them to the punch. Not only were these men now exhausted, starving, and frostbitten, but they wouldn't even be remembered as the team to reach the South Pole first, and now they had to make the long return trip back to base camp. You can see how miserable and distraught they all look here, not to mention very unwell. Definitely frostbitten. Tragically, the team would never make it home alive. The weather was harsh, they were already suffering from exhaustion, and they were running out of supplies. The first member of the team to pass was Edgar Evans, who died on February 17th of 1912. Then Lawrence Oates willingly walked out into a blizzard, ending his own life. Scott, along with Edward Wilson, Henry Bowers, and Edgar Evans, kept going, but things got worse. The storm ended up trapping them in their tent for 9 whole days, and they couldn't move. They died in the tent, just 11 miles away from where they could get more supplies. This is a photograph taken in 1986 of what were known as the Chernobyl liquidators. See those white stripes, the patterns at the bottom of this photo? That was caused by radiation on the film. The Chernobyl liquidators were a group of people who were called in to clean up the mess after the Chernobyl nuclear disaster in 1986. Their job was to try and make things safer for dealing with the radioactive contamination. These were regular folks, soldiers, firefighters, and other workers who faced really dangerous conditions to help control the aftermath. These workers had to deal with high levels of radiation, and many of them got sick later on due to exposure. They didn't have fancy gear like we might see today. In fact, there wasn't even enough protective equipment for everyone, so some of them had to construct their own out of leather and lead plates. It was an incredibly tough and risky job, and they faced severe health consequences because of it. Some, of course, even died because of the exposure. Alright, this is a pretty famous photograph in the world of paranormal photography, and for good reason. This picture has a pretty chilling tale behind it. It's a very classic kind of ghost story. Back in 1924, during a routine voyage, tragedy struck the SS Watertown when 2 crew members, James Courtney and Michael Meehan, lost their lives and were buried at sea. 2 men had been sent to the ship's interior cofferdam to clean and do repairs, but they were unaware there was poisonous gas leaking into the area they were working in, and they died inhaling the fumes. What followed was this series of events that would go down in maritime history as one of the eeriest tales ever told by seafarers. After the burial, the remaining crew reported an unsettling sight. They claimed to see ghostly faces appearing in the water alongside the ship, and the faces looked just like Courtney and Meehan. One crew member managed to snap the famous photo that is now infamous, seemingly revealing their ghostly faces in the water. Alright, want to see part of the underground hideout of a Russian doomsday cult? Well, you're looking at it. This is one of those images you can kind of smell just by looking at. Never a good thing. Pyotr Kuznetsov led a strange group called the True Russian Orthodox Church, and in 2007 he convinced his followers to barricade themselves inside a cave. Kuznetsov wasn't with them because police had him in custody. He claimed to be a prophet, combining Christian teachings with visions of the world ending. So why did they hide in a cave? Well, they genuinely thought the world was about to end, and by shutting themselves away, they believed they could shield themselves from the apocalypse. The police found out where the cave was, but the people inside threatened to harm themselves if the police tried to step in, and after a few months, yes, months, spent in that cave, the Russian security forces finally stepped in. 2 members had actually already died in the cave and were creating dangerous fumes for the folks that were still alive. Awful. Eventually, though, they were hauled out of there. Does this look like a place you'd want to spend the night in? Probably not. It's run down, clearly abandoned. It'd probably be squatters, and there's no furniture. But even worse than all of that, this is said to be one of the most haunted places in Italy. In the quiet village of Kona stands an abandoned house known as Villa Magnoni, left vacant and untouched now for many years. Its windows, aside from one, are completely sealed up. Back in the late 80s, a group of curious young men decided to venture into this abandoned mansion. They actually managed to break in, but once inside, they heard something. It was the distant sound of children singing. At least that's what it sounded like, and it was seemingly coming from the garden. They went outside to investigate, but when they got there, it was completely empty. As they were looking around, an old woman suddenly appeared in the window above them in the house. She scolded and insulted them, demanding they leave the premises immediately. The teenagers did the smart thing and hastily booked it out of there, but just after they'd hopped into their car and began peeling off, they got into an accident. 3 of them ended up losing their lives in the crash, leaving only 1 survivor. In the aftermath, the villagers took the precautions and sealed off all the windows of Villa Magnoni, believing someone or something dark was lingering inside the property. Weeks later, they discovered that the covering on one specific window, the very one where the old woman had appeared to scold and curse the boys, was mysteriously uncovered.
Coming in at number 3, Blanche Monnier. Born in 1849, Blanche Monnier was a well-respected French socialite from a conservative bourgeoisie family. Acclaimed for astounding beauty, by her early 20s there were plenty of suitors who fancied her hand, and by 1876, at the age of 27, she finally found a man who she wished to marry. However, the man in question, a penniless lawyer, was not to her mother's liking, and so in a fit of disapproval, her mother decided to lock her daughter in a tiny dark room in the attic of their home, where poor Blanche remained hidden from sunlight and humanity for the next 25 years of her life. Now, beyond the obviously awful parts about this decision, her mother spent the next 25 years claiming her daughter was missing, playing the victim of a mourning mother. Meanwhile, with the help of her son and Blanche's brother Marcel, let her daughter literally rot, starve, and go mad in isolation. That was until May of 1901, when the Paris Attorney General received an anonymous letter revealing the location and depravity of Madame Monnier's prisoner, and when the police arrived, they couldn't believe their eyes. As you can see in this photo, Blanche was in an unrecognizable state, covered in rotten food, her own feces, and weighing a mere 50 pounds. Police said the stench in that room was so vile they could barely stay long enough to get her out of there. In the end, Blanche was taken to live the rest of her life in a facility as she suffered extreme mental health disorders from the cruelties she experienced, though sadly justice was never really served. Her mother died shortly after she was found, and her brother was acquitted, as at the time, duty to rescue was not a part of the penal code. Coming in at number 2, rings. Starting in 1933 up until the end of World War II, we are all very well aware that the evil German party operated more than 1,000 camps and inflicted some of the most cruel, inhumane, and diabolical acts on millions of prisoners, especially targeting the Jewish population. Now, while this is by no means the most awful photo depicting this period in time, it does however showcase the gravity in a new light. This photo, dating back to May 5th, 1945, shortly after the defeat of the dictatorship, US troops stumbled across this giant box of wedding rings prisoners were forced to remove so that the party could repurpose the high-quality gold. Among these rings, they also found watches, eyeglasses, gold fillings that would have been extracted from the prisoners' teeth, and precious stones. And so while this photo may look rather innocent compared to some of the others on this list, it is in fact anything but. Coming in at number 3, James Jameson. One of the heirs to the Jameson whiskey family fortune, Jameson considered himself to be an adventurer of sorts, and often traveled to far-off lands, detailing the trips in his diary. In 1888, Jameson decided to head out to explore the Congo, and while there he wrote about and demanded some gruesome things from the locals. So before beginning this expedition, Jameson discovered that the area he was visiting was known to have a population that participated in the eating of other humans. Apparently, Jameson set out to witness it firsthand, which, I mean, why was that his dream? A little suspicious if you ask me, but I digress. According to Assad Farhan, who was his translator for the trip, Jameson bought a girl from a trader of slaves for a few handkerchiefs and gave her over to the tribe to be Allegedly, he didn't pay the tribe directly, but in a roundabout way, he did sort of pay to have this girl killed. What's even more gross is that he proceeded to draw and paint watercolors of the gruesome event while it happened, which again, just wrong on so many levels. Coming in at number 2, Cambodian Barbies. You may have been taught about the Khmer Rouge in history class, but if they don't ring a bell, essentially they were an extreme communist regime in Cambodia that held government between 1975 to 1979. They were known for being extremely cruel and committed some of the most horrifying acts of genocide in history, with nearly 2 million perishing under their ruling. Now, during their radical rule, the entire country was isolated from all foreign influences. This included closing schools, hospitals, factories, banks, foreign agriculture. They believed this would stimulate the rebirth of the country, but of course, all it did was send it into desolate famine and poverty. Led by a man named Pol Pot, the people of the country could not forage for food, despite the fact that everyone was starving, and anyone who disobeyed the orders was killed. Apparently, as the people became more and more desperate, they began to turn to folk magic, turning Barbie dolls into smoking talismans for luck. Thankfully, since its dissolution in 1999, all the leaders have been jailed for their atrocities, and the people are freed from the genocidal regime. And last up, in our number 1 spot, the Rabbit Woman. Her name was Mary Toft, and in 1726 she became known throughout Surrey, England as having been the woman who gave birth to rabbits. Now, I know what you're thinking, that isn't possible. And you would be right, but still the story of how she convinced people it was real was crazy. Apparently Toft was actually pregnant at one point, but miscarried, and it could have been this that sent her into her madness. Toft began declaring that she was giving birth to various animal parts, and so her local doctor became involved in the case. At first, everyone actually believed her, as in fact a rabbit did, well, come out of her. And with a doctor backing up her claims, the king and his royal surgeon got involved. Unlike her local doctor, the king's surgeon was skeptical, and after discovering corn inside the stomach of one of the rabbits and hay in their droppings, it proved the animal hadn't developed inside Mary. Eventually, Mary Toft admitted to the hoax and explained that she had manually inserted the animals inside her to make the delivery as realistic as possible. She was immediately imprisoned for fraud, and the medical community was ridiculed for having been fooled.
Number 9, an inmate at the Rab Camp. The Rab Camp was one of several Italian concentration camps, and it was established during World War II in July 1942 on the Italian-occupied island of Rab, now in Croatia. Estimates of the Commission for Determining the Crimes of the Occupiers say 4,641 detainees died at the camp, including 800 inmates who died while being transported from Rab to other concentration camps in Italy. In July 1943, after the fall of the fascist regime in Italy, the camp was closed, but some of the remaining Jewish prisoners were deported by German forces to the extermination camps. Under Italian Army Commander Mario Rotatta's watch, the ethnic cleansing and violence committed against the Slovene civilian population included summary executions, hostage-taking and ending the hostages' lives, reprisals, and the burning of houses and villages. Slovenes and Croatians suffered from cold and hunger in open-air tents, surrounded by barbed wire fence and guarded towers. At its peak, there were up to 15,000 internees. Conditions at the camp were described as appalling, filthy, muddy, overcrowded, and swarming with insects. This photo just shows how much suffering they went through. Number 8. A jail cell from the Salem witch trials. This makeshift jail cell truly brings out the horrors of the Salem witch trials. These trials were a series of hearings and prosecutions of people accused of witchcraft in colonial Massachusetts between February 1692 and May 1693. More than 200 people were accused, 30 people were found guilty, 19 of whom were executed by hanging. Now, women vastly outnumbered men in the ranks of accused and executed. It was in cells like this one that the accused witches spent their final moments before being executed. Now, it's just sad because we all know that this was just a scare and that they weren't real witches. Many of these women were suspected and chosen because they were simply unliked. Number 7. Pyramids on the moon. In 1972, this image was taken by Apollo 17 during its flight to the moon near an area known as Geophone Rock. NASA listed the image as blank, but after retouching the photo, you can see that it's not completely blank. Turning up the contrast, a pyramidal structure can be seen. So, what is it? Was it some malfunction of the camera, or is there actually a pyramid on the moon? NASA has never given a credible version of the issue, which has led to some speculations about what actually can be on the moon, hidden from the public. And listen, not to be a crazy conspiracy theorist, but maybe it is true that aliens built the pyramids on Earth as they look like they did it on the moon too. I don't know, but it gives you a lot to think about. While this eye looks like it may belong to a scary monster, it's actually a human eye. While rummaging through photographs that capture the devastating impact of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki, this photo emerged. On the 6th and 9th of August 1945, the United States detonated 2 atomic the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki respectively. The aerial bombings together ended the lives between 129,000 and 226,000 people. Most of whom were civilians. When the bomb detonated at 1,900 feet above the city center of Hiroshima, the subsequent explosion caused temperatures of 10,000 degrees Fahrenheit to annihilate nearly everything within 1,600 feet of blast zone. Almost anything and anyone within a mile was destroyed. And heat were so extreme that they bleached the city's exposed surfaces, except in places where an unsuspecting person shielded the building or sidewalk or bridge from the blast with their own body in their final moments alive. Now, this is what the eye of an victim plagued by an atomic rack looks like. While it had been a well-known fact that radiation causes cataracts in animals, the development of atomic cataracts in human beings was noted after the atomic in Japan. Now, it wasn't just this person who suffered from this, but many others as well.
Starting off our list today with Christopher Lloyd, because if we're going to talk about celebrities time traveling, we have to include the celebrity who brought the concept of time travel into the mainstream of pop culture 39 years ago with the release of Back to the Future. That's right, it is entirely possible that not only does Christopher Lloyd play a time traveler, but that he actually is one too. Before you start calling me crazy in the comments, 1, remember you are the one who decided to click on this video, and 2, take a look at this. This being a side-by-side image of Christopher Lloyd and John C. Calhoun. John C. Calhoun being a vocal statesman from South Carolina who also served as the 7th Vice President of the United States from 1925 to 1932. The resemblance is uncanny, likely because they're not actually 2 separate men, but rather because Christopher Lloyd, as he is known today, really is John C. Calhoun, as he was known back in the 1800s. Next up, we have Justin Timberlake, teenage heartthrob, bad boy, crappy ex-boyfriend to Britney Spears, and possible time traveler? Turns out it's entirely possible that Timberlake has been breaking hearts for far longer than was once believed. Also, he might have, at one time, lived in Liverpool. I say that because of this. A side-by-side of Justin Timberlake and the mugshot of an unknown man working in the Liverpool mines far before Justin Timberlake was ever supposed to have been born. It's like that guy's his mirror, and his mirror is staring back at him. As for what the mine worker was charged with, I'm not sure, but I'm willing to bet it ain't nothing but a mistake. In sync, I think. No, Backstreet Boys. Sorry guys.
Pictured here is a woman named Ina Squire Brown. She was a professional dancer and, as you can clearly see, soon to be married. Her fiance was Royal Air Force Officer J.C. Martin. What's incredible about this image is when and where it was taken. November 5th, 1940 in London. The photo was colorized a couple years back. All that rubble you see on the lawn, that was part of her home, which had just recently been bombed. And the craziest part was that the bombing had been going on for months and would continue on for months. On September 7th of 1940, the Germans began dropping bombs on English towns and cities in what was referred to as a blitzkrieg, which translates to lightning war. And for 57 consecutive nights, the bombs continued to fall. London was hit the hardest, but this was happening all over the country. So this photo was taken in the midst of all that. An image that perfectly captures the strength and perseverance of the greatest generation. Despite the chaos, the uncertainty, their home crumbling around them, and by that I mean their city and by extension the entire country, Ina Squire Brown, pictured here with her father and neighbor, had smiles on their faces and were going on about their lives. They kept calm and carried on.
Bringing us up today, we have the location of the Maid of Harlech, a Lockheed P-38F Lightning long-range fighter jet whose whereabouts is strictly prohibited from being documented publicly, via photograph or otherwise. The jet, which was operated during the Second World War, was an incredibly effective weapons craft, night fighter, and observational aircraft. The plane eventually ended up somewhere along the 4-mile Harlech beach as a result of none other than human error. You see, the pilot, Second Lieutenant Robert F. Elliott of the US military, had taken off using the aircraft's reserve fuel tanks. Not an uncommon practice, but it seems he had forgotten to switch back to the main reserve as 55 minutes into the flight, the left engine lost power. Thinking there was an issue with the engine, Elliott decided to make his way back to the airfield, but before he could, the right engine died too. Elliott made an emergency landing along the shores of the British beach where, luckily, no one was injured, and the plane was eventually claimed by the sand. It wasn't until 65 years later in 2007 that the craft was discovered by a civilian. While many locals are aware of the plane's exact location, the distribution of such information is prohibited by the UK government due to its protected status, which was awarded in an attempt to preserve the wreck as well as the wreck site. Next up, we have images of Winnie the Pooh, which became censored in 2017 in China. While China does have a rich history of censorship in which the ban of Gmail, Google, YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram, as well as Twitter, now X, are included, no one could have predicted the addition of our honey-loving childhood friend to the list. Images of the funny orange bear became censored after a resemblance was noted between the character and the Chinese Communist Party General Secretary Xi Jinping. The government found the comparison to be a disrespectful mockery of their country's leader and consequently ordered all images of Winnie the Pooh to be blocked from all available search engines, limited as they may be. Next up, we have a series of photos taken during the Great Depression that were banned from being publicly released at the time due to the, well, depressing nature of the content. The photographs were taken by Dorothea Lange, Walker Evans, and a number of their colleagues in an attempt to showcase resilient faces in contrast to the backgrounds of ruin in the United States during the depths of the Great Depression. When the photos were presented to the Farm Security Administration, they were not only rejected, but in an attempt to keep them from being published, were hole punched generally directly through the focal point of the image in the hopes of making them unprintable. Ironically, all this did was garner the images that much more fame and recognition, as when they were eventually released, they not only stood for the people's resilience against the economic collapse, but also freedom of the press. Next up, we have America's hidden bunker, Mount Pony. The 400-foot-long, 140,000-square-foot bunker made with 1-foot-thick steel reinforced concrete was built in 1969 and was a self-sustaining, fully equipped, radiation-hardened facility designed originally as a safe haven to house up to 540 people for up to 30 days in the case of a nuclear attack. However, in 1988, the bunker became much more, as it was used to store several $billion of federal funds that would be used to replenish US currency and restart the economy in an event of a nuclear attack. The money was stored in the bunker for just shy of 10 years until it was relocated in 1997. Understandably, it was incredibly important at the time that any imagery of the bunker's location, layout, and security functions not be released to the public, as it would diminish the secure nature of the underground safe house and holding facility. At our halfway point, we have a series of photographs taken at a United States nuclear power plant depicting the dangerous conditions in which the country stores its nuclear energy, as well as what the plant workers have to endure. A report released by CNN in 2016 showcases the facility in its decrepit state. After the photographs surfaced, nuclear officials used them as an opportunity to request Congress back the administration's push to modernize the facility. Officials also argued that the state of the facility was actually a threat to United States national security goals and said that many critical utility, safety, and support systems had been failing at a dangerous rate, due largely to the fact that the majority of key nuclear facilities in the US
US were built during World War II with the intention of operating for just 10 to 15 years and have therefore outlived their safe operational lifespan. It seems as though the warnings and pleadings of the nuclear officials have gone unheeded and unheard, as the plants depicted in the photographs appear to have undergone no repairs and presumably just continue to deteriorate. No wonder the government didn't want anyone seeing those photos. It's terrifying and they're not doing anything about it. Alright, next up we have a photograph of leaked Mexican asylum plans delivered to us by none other than the former United States President Donald Trump. Amidst negotiations with Mexico, Trump called a conference to reveal that he had a secret deal, that is. In the interview, when asked if Trump had made an agreement with Mexico to become a safe third country for asylum seekers, he refused to comment on his discussions with the Mexican president, but instead pulled out a folded piece of paper from his coat's breast pocket and said, "That's the agreement that everybody says I don't have." And if you're like most people, you might have assumed that what Trump presented to the reporters was nothing more than a blank sheet of folded paper. Well, you would have assumed wrong, as not only was Trump holding a legitimate government document, but it was legitimately legible, as the sun hit the back of the agreement, illuminating the words printed on the page, which were swiftly captured in a photograph that was enhanced to reveal, long story short, that Mexico was to be considered a safe third country, meaning asylum applicants would be processed in Mexico instead of the United States, and that in order for this to happen, Mexico would have 45 days to reduce migration to the United States. Okay, I am thinking this next one trumps the rest. Well, no, actually, I mean Trump should take a rest from spilling government secrets. I don't know why, but this one actually made me laugh because just reading the headline made me feel like I was being punked. Trump tweets sensitive surveillance images of Iran obtained from a spy satellite. What is going on in the House of Commons? I know that's a Canadian thing, but really. So the image Trump tweeted was of the fallout from a failed Iranian missile launch, and it was taken from a secret spy satellite that no one except officials with incredibly high clearance is supposed to even know about. At first, people wondered if the image had been taken by a drone, since it was so incredibly clear with lots of discernible detail, but aerospace experts quickly determined that it was in fact taken by a satellite. Not only that, but based on the image alone, experts were also able to trace exactly which satellite the image came from. I don't know. It's too much for me. Alright, and to finish us off today, we have another good laugh, as the Thai king, whose name I am scared to even attempt to pronounce, but I will place it somewhere here, has banned all unflattering photos of himself. Now you might think that means that if a person were to capture him mid-yawn or sneeze, they would have to delete the image, in which the king looks a little bit silly and perhaps slightly less than regal. Well, you'd be wrong again, my friends, because this king likes to party. Not only that, but he likes to cover himself in temporary tattoos and party all night long, which usually ends up in the disheveled king dressed in nothing but jeans and a very small crop top or sports bra, heading home in his town car the morning after. Now, for the people of Germany, which is where the Thai king spends most of his time, this is not an uncommon thing to see. But for the people of Thailand, any photos of the king's escapades are censored and banned from being shared with any members of the public. In 1921, Elizabeth L. Gardner, pictured here in the pilot seat of a Martin B-26 Marauder, became one of the first American female pilots to serve in a world war. She had been trained by Lieutenant Colonel Paul Tibbets, who later went on to command the B-29 aircraft that dropped the first atom bomb on Hiroshima. During her time as an active member of the Air Force, Gardner flew many medium-sized bomber planes, as well as aircrafts that towed aerial targets. In 1939, the WASP organization was formed, WASP being an abbreviation for Women Air Force Service Pilots, after a woman named Jackie Cochran wrote to the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, suggesting the idea of using female pilots in non-combat missions. Gardner joined the organization, which eventually disbanded in 1944. In 2009, after Gardner's many years of service, she and the remaining living members of the WASP organization were recognized with the Congressional Gold Medal for their service, one of the oldest and highest civilian awards given out in the United States.
This photograph was also snapped in the midst of the London Blitz of 1940, a milkman walking through mounds of rubble to carry out his deliveries. War or not, people still needed their milk. This one was taken by a photographer named Fred Morley on October 9th, just a month after the attacks began. Now, although this photo was genuinely taken at the time, right after a bombing the previous night, it is somewhat staged. See, the Ministry of War wanted to keep everyone's morale high, which was not an easy task given that the Germans were destroying people's homes on a nightly basis, so photographs of the destruction were often censored or just kept out of newspapers altogether. Photographer Fred Morley was frustrated by this. Not only did he feel the need to document what was going on, but he felt that people deserved to see what was truly happening as well. So he compromised. Morley grabbed his assistant, dressed him up as a milkman, and had some firemen who were working on bridges nearby pose in the background, and then snapped this now iconic photo. It showed the destruction left in the wake of the previous night's attack, while also sending an uplifting message to the people of England that they weren't going to let the war break them.
If you are currently using a friction heater, aka a radiator, or if you ever have, Charles S.L. Baker, pictured here demonstrating his radiator system in 1906 next to his unnamed assistant, is the man whom you should send your thank you notes. Born into slavery on August 3rd of 1859, at the age of 15, Baker began working as an assistant to his father, who was an express agent at the time. It was then that Baker developed his interest in the mechanical sciences. He spent decades perfecting his invention, experimenting with different forms of friction using bricks and various types of metal, and after 23 years, he did it. Charles S.L. Baker invented the first ever friction heating device known to man in the form of two metal cylinders stacked one inside of the other with a spinning wooden core in the center to produce the friction, and subsequently heat. After his success, Baker went on to start a manufacturing business for his heating device, the Friction Heat and Boiler Company, which was established in 1904. His company raised $136,000 in capital, equal to almost $5 million today. Baker went on to marry, and his wife eventually gave birth to a daughter named Lulu Bell Baker. When Charles died on May 5th of 1926, he had revolutionized the scientific industry and had changed the way people view the possibilities of simple friction forever.
You're probably thinking this is an AI generated image, but this is actually a genuine photograph. The photo was captured in 1903. Standing in the middle is a photographer named James Rickleton. On either side of him are the Kashmir Giants. Can't miss them. James Rickleton was a photographer and world traveler in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He set out to explore different cultures and capture their lives through his camera. One of his most fascinating adventures took him to Kashmir, a region in the northern part of the Indian subcontinent. There he met these two men, dubbed the Kashmir Giants. The guy on the left stood at 7'9", the one on the right 7'4". Kind of crazy that a 7'4" guy is being dwarfed by an even larger man. That's just nuts.
Here's a photo of a man with a firm grasp on the importance of space travel, watching the 1968 Apollo 8 space launch with his wife. That rocket's going up. The Apollo rocket, that is. The first ever spacecraft to leave Earth's gravitational sphere, and the first manned mission to reach the moon. Although the crew, made up of 3 astronauts, Frank Borman, James Lovell, and William Anders, didn't actually step foot on the moon, their spacecraft orbited the lunar body 10 times before returning safely back to Earth. The astronauts aboard Apollo 8 were the first to photograph the far side of the moon, pictured here, and the first to witness an Earthrise, which is like a sunrise but with the Earth.
What an apocalyptic image this is. It looks like a dystopian painting, but it isn't. It's a colorized photograph of the ruins of Stalingrad, one of the biggest, most brutal battles in all of World War II. It took place between August of 1942 and February of 1943. The Germans wanted to capture Stalingrad. It was a key industrial city and would give them control over the Volga River. But the Soviets were determined to defend the city at all costs. And defend it they did. The battle raged for months, with both sides suffering huge losses. Soldiers fought in the streets, buildings, factories. Some of the most intense combat happened house to house. The turning point came in November of 1942, when the Soviets launched a massive counterattack encircling the German forces. This operation, called Operation Uranus, trapped the Germans inside the city with no way to escape. The German troops eventually couldn't hold out, and in February of 1943, they surrendered.
I'm pretty positive every one of you watching this video has heard of the Titanic, the unsinkable ship that sank just 4 days after its maiden voyage began, but I bet you haven't seen this photograph. For context, approximately 1,500 people died on April 14th of 1912 after the Titanic struck an iceberg around 2 a.m. and became completely submerged underwater in less than 3 hours. While not a guarantee, those who made it onto the ship's lifeboats did have a higher chance at survival. This photograph shows the Titanic's collapsible lifeboat D, which had been lowered from the port side of the large vessel as it went down. The lifeboat was rescued by the RMS Carpathia, another transatlantic ship, around 7:15 a.m. Ironically, 6 years after rescuing the Titanic survivors after their escape from a sinking ship, the RMS Carpathia would also sink after being struck by a German U-boat.
Oh, mirror selfies, so rarely do they work. This is one of those rare cases. Did people take mirror selfies in the 1920s? Well, this Japanese couple did. This photographer snapped a picture of him and his wife sometime in the 1920s. We don't know the names of these people or the exact date the photo was taken. The only info I could find was that a photographer named Hamish Campbell, who'd been based in Tokyo, came across the photo in 2014 while searching through an abandoned home. On the second floor of the home, Campbell had come across a closet that had once been used as a darkroom. There he found hundreds of negatives, including the image you see here. They were all taken by the man in the picture. Other photographs included his wedding, the day-to-day lives of the family, hangouts with neighbors, and pictures like this here of his pet monkey. Yeah, I think this is just a cute one. Good way to end things off.
Alright, moving on from music and television celebrities to celebrity activists. She's small, she's mighty, and she might have lived 124 years ago in 1898. It's Greta Thunberg. Before you start yelling, "How dare you make that assumption" at me through your computer screens, take a look at this. An image of a young woman who looks exactly like Greta and wears her hair incredibly similarly to Greta, cultivating the land in a way that Greta would have likely approved of alongside 2 unknown children. Okay, I'm not actually sure what they're doing in the photo, but I don't see any big polluting machinery anywhere in the photo, so I'd say it's probably Greta approved. Maybe because it is Greta. If this is true and Greta Thunberg really is a time traveler and she's seen the future, maybe we should start listening to her. Next up, we have Keanu Reeves, who has apparently lived many lives over many centuries. That's right, not only has he been in The Matrix, John Wick, Deep Web, The Whole Truth, Devil's Advocate, and so many other big films, apparently he has also been portrayed in paintings dating all the way back to 1530. Now, I'm going to show you a photo, but if it ends up being a bit too much to handle, don't worry, because there's a pill for that. It's either red or blue, I forget which. Anyways, take a look at this 1530 Italian painting of a man who is unknown, but not that unknown because it's clearly Keanu Reeves. You know who else is Keanu Reeves? This guy, Paul Monet, a popular French actor who lived during the late 19th and early 20th century, and because he's Keanu Reeves, also today in the 21st century. It's not a coincidence, it's Keanu. Next up, we've got Eddie Murphy. While some of you might know him from films such as Norbit, The Nutty Professor, Meet Dave, Tower Heist, Trading Places, Mr. Church, and Shrek, my personal favorite, other people know him as the classy man who dressed and photographed quite well during a time long before Eddie Murphy was supposedly born. Take a look. I mean, with the resemblance, it's more than clear as day that these two are one of a kind, probably because they are one man living across time. While this might seem perplexing, the real question here is, do you think the unknown classy man, as he is referred to on the internet, likes parfait? I mean, everybody likes parfait, and waffles, and boulders. That's a nice boulder. Next up, we've got Bruce Willis, star of Die Hard, The Sixth Sense, Glass, Unbreakable, Pulp Fiction, Split, Red, Armageddon, and an army general that was living in the late 19th and 20th century? Well, take a look. That's right, not only has Bruce Willis been awarded countless awards for film and television, including an Emmy, it is entirely possible that at one point Bruce Willis once went by the name Douglas MacArthur and was awarded many medals for providing exemplary service during his time serving as a general for the US military during World War II. Maybe one day he'll play his past self in a movie. Yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker. Next up, we have 2 more than lifelong friends, Daniel Radcliffe and Andy Samberg, 2 great actors with great achievements who have apparently been around for a great deal of time, according to this photograph. A photo taken of the pair in 1978, the year Sandberg was supposedly born, and 11 years before Radcliffe's supposed birth, found in an old high school yearbook. Give it up, guys. We know. You're a time traveler, Harry. And Andy's got a time machine in a box. That's a reference. Next up, we have a 19th century McConaughey. That's right, apparently this guy has been ripping through the fabric of space and time since long before Interstellar hit the big screen and the quest to return to Murph ensued. If you've seen the movie or any of these movies, maybe you'll get my references. Anyways, apparently he wasn't always a movie star. At one point he was this guy, just a simple pipe-smoking, bird-watching man from Alabama living, smoking, and watching in the 1800s. The man truly hasn't aged. I guess after so many years of just watching, McConaughey finally decided he'd rather be the watchee, and now he has an Oscar. Next up, not only has Jay-Z been around the block, but according to this photo, he's been around for an incredibly long time, since the 1930s at least, which is when this photo of this man, who looks an awful lot like Jay-Z, was taken in Harlem, not far from where Jay-Z supposedly grew up in Brooklyn. And when I say not far, I mean not far. Harlem to Brooklyn is only about a 50-minute drive, a 1-hour subway, a 1.5-hour bike ride, and a 4.5-hour walk. Why did I look all of that up? For you guys, of course. Considering the fact that this photo was taken in 1939 and Jay-Z supposedly wasn't born until 1964, I say he would have had plenty of time to get from Harlem to Brooklyn, and plenty of time to figure out the lyrics to Empire State of Mind. He's also been quoted saying, "I'm not afraid of dying," probably because he has a time machine that allowed him to go into the future and find the elixir of everlasting life, or something along those lines. And finally we have the speed round. First up, we've got Nick Cage, pictured in the 1800s living under an unknown alias. And then of course there is Johnny Depp, who looks exactly like someone's grandfather, probably because he traveled back in time to hook up with someone under 25, and he is whoever posted this photo's grandfather. It was anonymous on Reddit. Next up we have John Travolta and this guy, who is clearly just John Travolta living in the 1860s. Michael Jackson, who clearly traveled back in time to ancient Egypt, otherwise how the heck would this bust exist? Peter Dinklage obviously wanted a taste of medieval life, hence his appearances on Game of Thrones, and this painting of Sebastian de Mora painted in 1645. And finally, we have Mark Zuckerberg, who traveled all the way back to the 1600s to finally gain some respect as the King of Spain.
Number 5. The Babushka Lady. The woman in the brown coat, or the Babushka Lady as she was later called by the FBI, was very close to JFK when he was assassinated in Dallas. Traveling in a presidential motorcade through downtown Dallas, JFK was assassinated, hit once in the back and once in the head. Kennedy was taken to Parkland Hospital for emergency medical treatment, where he was pronounced dead 30 minutes later. Now, Lee Harvey Oswald was charged with Kennedy's assassination. He denied. Oswald then was as well soon after. These theories allege the involvement of the CIA, the Mafia, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, Cuban Prime Minister Fidel Castro, the KGB, or some combination. Now, according to eyewitnesses though, this woman, the Babushka Lady, filmed the entire thing. It's thought that from her vantage point, she may have been able to answer some critical questions about what really happened that day. However, the FBI was never able to track her down, and no one has since been able to figure out the identity of this mystery observer. Number 3. The Dyatlov Pass Incident. The Dyatlov Pass incident was an event in which 9 Soviet hikers died in the northern Ural Mountains between February 1st and 2nd, 1959, under uncertain circumstances. This creepy photo shows the determined group traversing the harsh terrain just before they met their fate on the night of February 1st. The experienced trekking group from the Ural Polytechnical Institute, led by Igor Dyatlov, had established a camp in the Russian SFSR of the Soviet Union. Now, overnight, something caused them to cut their way out of their tent and flee the campsite while inadequately dressed for the heavy snowfall and sub-zero temperatures. Now, after the group's bodies were discovered, an investigation by Soviet authorities determined that 6 of them had died from hypothermia, while the other 3 had died by physical trauma. One victim had major skull damage, 2 had severe chest trauma, and another had a small crack in his skull. 4 of the bodies were found lying in running water in a creek, and 3 of those 4 had damaged soft tissue of the head and face. 2 of the bodies had missing eyes, 1 had a missing tongue, and 1 had missing eyebrows. Number 2. Treatment of a patient with mental illness. This 1890 photo depicts a woman forced into a crucifixion pose and facing a wall. The woman is a patient at a mental institution undergoing treatment. Now, believe it or not, forced standing was considered a legitimate part of treatment for mental illness in 19th century Germany. Now, back in the 18th and early 20th century, women were sometimes institutionalized due to their opinions and their inability to be controlled properly by a primarily male-dominated culture. There were financial incentives too, because before the passage of the Married Women's Property Act 1882, all of a wife's assets passed automatically to her husband. The men who were in charge of these women, either a husband, father, or brother, could send these women to mental institutions, stating they believed that these women were mentally ill because of their strong opinions. These men had the last say when it came to the mental health of these women, so if they believed that these women were mentally ill, or if they simply wanted to silence the voices and opinions of these women, they could easily send them to mental institutions. This is what could have happened to this woman in that photograph. Now, besides standing, practices at these asylums were dark, as they had treatments that included restraints, isolation, electroshock therapy, ice baths, forced drugging, and even lobotomies. And coming in at number 1 is mustard gas tested on American military. Mustard gas is a type of chemical warfare agent, and as a chemical weapon, mustard gas was first used in World War I. In 1943, the US Navy exposed its own sailors to mustard gas. Now, officially, the Navy was testing the effectiveness of new clothing and gas masks against the deadly gas that had proven so terrifying in the First World War. Young men were approached after 8 weeks of boot camp and asked if they wanted to participate in an experiment that would help shorten the war. Obviously, they said yes, but they didn't know what they were signing up for. Only when the boys reached the research laboratory were they told the experiment involved mustard gas. Now, the participants, almost all of whom suffered several external and internal burns, were ignored by the Navy and in some cases were threatened with the Espionage Act. In 1991, the reports were finally declassified and taken before Congress.
This is one of the last photos taken of the Apollo 1 crew on the day a deadly fire erupted during a pre-launch test. All 3 astronauts lost their lives. On January 27th of 1967, during a pre-launch test for the Apollo program, the crew of Apollo 1, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger B. Chaffee, were conducting a test at Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The spacecraft was mounted on its launch vehicle. The purpose of the test was to check the spacecraft's systems and conditions, simulating a launch, with external power sources disconnected. During the test, though, the crew encountered an issue. A fire broke out in the pure oxygen environment of the command module's cabin. The fire spread incredibly fast because of the highly flammable materials that were used at the time to construct the spacecraft. This is one of the last known photographs taken of a man named Michael Rockefeller, the son of New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, who never returned home from an expedition to Dutch New Guinea, now part of Indonesia, in 1961. Michael was on a mission to study the Asmat people, an indigenous tribe known for their unique art and customs, and while on an art collecting expedition along the coast, Michael's boat capsized. He and a fellow explorer, Rene Wassing, tried to swim to the shore, which was about 12 miles away, but Wassing eventually became too exhausted, and Michael decided he was going to continue swimming alone, hoping to reach help. But Michael would never be seen again. Now, the famous theory is that the very tribe seen with him in this photograph ate him. Now, although cannibalism was still a bit of a thing in some areas of Asmat at the time, there's not a whole lot of evidence for that. It just makes for a sensational kind of story. There's another possibility that he was attacked by sharks or just succumbed to exhaustion. This is a photograph taken inside Waverly Hills Sanitarium in Kentucky, a hospital that became famous for treating patients suffering from tuberculosis. So yeah, a lot of people died there. It opened in 1910 to treat people with the deadly lung disease. Back then, there wasn't a cure for tuberculosis, so the sanitarium focused on providing fresh air and sunlight, thinking it might help patients get better. As the years went by, better treatments for tuberculosis came along, and the need for places like Waverly Hills decreased. The sanitarium eventually closed in 1961. After that, it went through various uses. It was an old folks' home for a short time. Nothing really stuck though. Now, what makes Waverly Hills famous, or maybe infamous, is its reputation for being very haunted. Over the years, people started to tell stories about strange things happening there. Glowing orbs, the sounds of disembodied coughs, footsteps making their way down the empty halls. One of the most famous stories is about a ghostly figure named Timmy. According to the tale, Timmy was a little boy who stayed at Waverly Hills and died there. People claim to have heard a child's laughter and seen a shadowy figure resembling a young boy. Because of all these stories, Waverly Hills has become pretty popular for ghost hunters. There have even been TV shows and documentaries filmed there. And finally, we have Mayenga Nasaka. Mayenga Nasaka was a nurse in Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, during a scary time in 1976, the Ebola outbreak. This photo captures one of the last moments of her life. Mayenga got infected with the Ebola virus while she was working at Mambalat Hospital in Kinshasa. She was caring for a nun who'd been brought in from Yambuku Mission Hospital where the outbreak started. The thing is, Mayenga's case became kind of famous because she was one of the first healthcare workers to get sick during the outbreak. In the picture, you can see her standing next to another nurse taking care of a patient, but here's the heartbreaking part. Just a few days after this photo was taken, Mayenga passed away. Hospital staff didn't have the right gear to protect themselves, and there weren't enough precautions to stop them from coming into contact with patients' blood or fluids. This was the very early stages of the outbreak, and people didn't know how dangerous the virus really was at the time. With all that said, I've been your host, James, and I will catch you, yes, you specifically, in the next video.
Want to see more videos like this one? Check out this video next. It's about mysterious creatures that defy explanation. Scientists are working tirelessly to find out what these creatures are. Hopefully, we can get more information as time goes, but watch the video for yourself to see these animals firsthand. What are you waiting for? Click the video now.